you were career military by choice, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so far we only have two
Yeah.
that are career
Well,
military by choice.
That was my intention going in as well, but nobody really knows until you've been there a while. I mean, some people, within a few weeks of getting in boot camp, some people figure out this is not for
Yeah.
them. And I had a friend who did that. And others, get through training or they're partway through their first combat tour and decide that's not what they know to do. But none of that was a surprise to me.
Yeah, and we'll ask you about your military career. We'll ask you about first day of Vietnam.
Mhm.
Like, were you ever actually in Vietnam?
Just to be, basically to change planes.
Yeah.
A couple times that took overnight. That's not entirely true. I was never stationed there.
Yeah.
But we flew out of Da Nang a lot. We'd go fly a mission and go into Da Nang and rearm. Or when we were in my second tour, when we were going over the north, sometimes tankers would run out of fuel and you'd have to land at Da Nang and refuel to get back to Thailand. But there was a campaign, and I can't tell you when it was, but it was in '72, and how about I stick it up my sleeve? I don't have to undo my shirt.
Sure. You just run it back, and
Yeah.
I'll pull it back here.
Yeah, that will do it. I can grab hold of the microphone first before it begins smelling bad, huh? Okay. And then rework the wire to be back behind me.
Yeah, I'll let me hook here first.
Help me.
Right
Well,
right
let's
here is
go around
good.
that way.
Yeah,
How's that?
and I need some slacks. Okay.
You got plenty.
There you go.
Anyway, there was a district headquarters village called An Loc that was a target, a serious target of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And by the end of the week, there was no village. But we flew to that a number of times. And you go in, like start at 4 o'clock in the morning and fly out, hit the tanker, go into An Loc. The either ground FAC or air FAC would tell you where to put your bombs. Go in, bomb, and while it was still things were hit and miss there, we'd also then strafe around outside the village where the bad guys. It was occupied by the friendlies, and the bad guys had it completely surrounded. And so there was almost no place except inside the city limits that you couldn't drop a bomb that wouldn't help.
Okay.
And then we'd go fly into we have a senior moment. Anyway, close by Air Base. Benoit, what's the name of it?
Yeah.
Rearm, refuel, go again.
Yeah, Benoit was where Staffney was stationed most of the time, run the transport detail.
Yeah. Well, then we rearm, go back to An Loc, drop some bombs, go back to Benoit, rearm, go back, drop some bombs, take off back, hit the tanker, and fly back to Thailand. And those were, it was hot, it was miserable, it was scary. I mean, we got shot at some, but it was small arms and 50 cal. It wasn't probably gonna, unless you just got a golden BB, it wasn't gonna hurt you. It was scary because the guys on the ground are just really desperate. And I can remember after 3 or 4 days of that, I don't know if it was the last time, but nearly last times, we had an American advisor on the ground with the South Vietnamese, and he was talking on the radio to the forward air controller that we were working with, and he said, we're about to be overrun. He said, hit my position, and we did. And nothing was ever heard of him. If anybody investigated that after the fact to see who lived and who didn't, I never heard, but that was, you hear a couple things on the radio that just break your heart, and that's the kind of thing that does. Anyway.
You ready?
Ready.
Okay. All right.
Let me get that position. Let's see if I have. Alright. Whenever you're ready, man.
Okay. State your name and spell it.
My name is Jim White, W-H-I-T-E.
The questions I'm going to ask you, they're not going to hear me. Yeah, I'm not mic'd up.
Okay.
So restate essentially what the question is that I asked, so that you could. So, when did you decide that you wanted a military career?
I decided I wanted a military career when I was very young. I had an uncle who was a pilot in the Air Force, and he flew fighters. And when he came to visit, he would fly in a T-33 and fly over the house. And when he buzzed the house, it was time to leave and go to Smyrna to the airport and pick him up.
At Seward Air Force Base.
Seward. And that was just, I always, I mean, from the time I was in kindergarten until I graduated from college, he was always kind of my ideal. And he did what I wanted to do.
So, where'd you grow up? I mean, I know this, but they don't.
I grew up in Cookeville. At the time, it was outside the southern city limits. It is now well inside the city limits. And we had a farm, and my brother and I were the farmers, and my sisters were the housekeepers, and we raised cattle and chickens and briefly hogs.
And did your father's military experience have any influence on your wanting to be in the military?
No, the only influence my father's experience had on my desires was he was in the Army in World War II and did a lot of island hopping in the Pacific and was in the Okinawa invasion. And his stories about that made me fairly certain that I didn't want to be a foot soldier.
So it is an influence.
It did.
So did you do ROTC?
I did ROTC because it was mandatory for 2 years. I didn't want to be in the Army. And there's a method by which you can do 4 years of Army ROTC and then transfer to the Air Force, but that was not certain. And the rate at which they were using up second lieutenants in the Army in 1966, the odds were not good that I would be anything but an infantryman. So I didn't go to the second 2 years of ROTC.
So you graduated from Tech,
I did. And I graduated from Tech in 1966.
and then you immediately enlisted?
Sort of, kind of. I was, I took the Air Force officer's exam when my junior year came around, and I scored highly, but I didn't pass the physical to go to flight training to be a pilot, which kind of devastated me. But then I got the notion that it would be okay to be a Air Force lawyer and become a JAG. And one of my good friends was going to UT at law school, so I went to visit him, and all of that seemed kind of cool. So I went and took the entrance exam for law school before I graduated from Tech. And then when I graduated from Tech, I'd put my application in to go to UT Law School, and, along with Bill Cameron and Rankin Bennett, who actually went to law school. But the 2 weeks before law school started, and I hadn't gotten my acceptance letter yet, I got a Dear Citizen letter from my local draft board. And so, having already done all the paperwork with the Air Force, I took it down to the recruiter and I said, I don't want to open this yet. Is that what I think it is? And he said, it will be. And I said, can I join the Air Force instead? And he said, yes, and I can take care of that letter. So I signed up for the Air Force right then I opened the letter, and it was indeed from the draft board, and they want me to go in the Army. So I didn't.
So where did you do basic?
Lackland was at the time the only place that both basic airman enlisted school and officer school was. So I went there. I had the opportunity to go to nav school instead of pilot training. And those classes were backed up at the time, so they postponed, the Air Force postponed me going in the Air Force for like 3 months until I could go from officer training to nav school. So I started officer training actually in February of 1967.
And that was at Lackland.
That was at Lackland.
So after you get out of basic, what's next?
Well, after basic, I went to Sacramento, California for navigator training, and I was in the last class to take navigator training in a propeller airplane. The Air Force was not putting any money into training assets at that time because they're spending all their money in Vietnam. So we had the interesting experience of flying a 2-engine propeller aircraft for navigator training. That took 6 months.
What kind of plane was that?
It was a T-29, which was the same thing. Airlines were flying, or had been flying those. They'd all gone to jets by then, but those were
Sort of like a DC-3 or
Convair 440.
Okay.
It was bigger than a DC-3, and it had a tricycle gear instead of a tail wheel. So in nav school, I got to do map reading and radar navigation and celestial navigation, which is the nearest thing to black magic I've ever encountered.
How so?
Well, it's you have a set of information, books of information about stars and planets that the Navy has been publishing since George Washington was a corporal, and you use that along with a fairly simple calculator to figure out roughly from where you are which stars would be positioned properly for you to shoot them with a sextant, and then you do that, and then you log the lines of position from the sextant, and that creates a triangle, and you should be at the center of that triangle. And sometimes we actually were.
So after you've completed navigation school, then what's your next post?
Well, because I was going into a flying occupation, the Air Force sent me to survival training, which was 2 weeks in Spokane, Washington, which is an interesting place to practice for Southeast Asia. But they had a series of classroom lectures, some escape and evasion training, a little 24-hour experience in a simulated POW camp, and very instructive. And then immediately following that, I went to Tucson, Arizona, where they did ground school for F-4s, the aircraft I was being assigned to. And so I spent 6 weeks there learning about the avionics and the navigation equipment, practicing in a simulator with the radar. And then 2 days later, I was at George Air Force Base in Southern California and got introduced to the F-4.
And so how long did you train on the F-4 before you went overseas?
I was in at George for 6 months, and we flew air-to-air and air-to-ground missions, and I flew with some old and bold fighter pilots that knew a lot of tricks that weren't in the book, and they would teach them to you on the QT. And that's my first ride was with an instructor, and after that I was paired with a front seater who had been in the back seat of the F-4 as a pilot, and he and I flew together for about 5 months and did gunnery missions with practice ordnance, and then we had a few trips with live ordnance that were instructive. And once again, Southern California is not exactly prepare you to go to the Southeast Asia.
So when did you get orders to head to Vietnam?
I had those orders before I graduated from fighter lead-in school at George. Following that, I went to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida for sea survival training. Again, we had classroom work and then field work ending up with being dropped in the Bay of Biscay with a one-man life raft to wait for a helicopter to come and get you. And while it was only an hour or so in the water, it seemed like a lot longer. And we were also in sight of probably 4 or 5 other guys in one-man life rafts, but the training experience is fairly realistic. I was supposed to then go to MacDill, Tampa, Florida, for training in a special project that was codenamed Igloo White. And nobody knew, they said, but it was fairly obvious when I flew into Ubon in Thailand one time. The guys who were actually in those missions were taxiing out in F4s with trees strapped to the bottom of their wings with the leaves flapping in the breeze. Turns out they were dropping sensors on the Ho Chi Minh Trail that then intelligence people would listen to the sounds of trucks going by or people talking or whatever, and then either use that information or give it to air crews to go interdict those ground troops. However, before I finished sea survival, the Air Force changed my orders and sent me, instead of going to Ubon, I was sent to UDORN as a regular backseater, and they cut the 6 weeks of Igloo White training out of my schedule and moved up my reporting date by 60 days.
So, where in Thailand is UBAN?
UDORN was in the northern part of Thailand, probably 60 miles south of the Laotian border.
Okay. How far is that from Karat?
Karat was well south.
Okay.
The U.S. airfields were down the middle of the plains in Thailand, UDORN being the northernmost one. There was a place, the name of which I don't remember, that was a bear base until
Utapao?
72. No, Utapao was on the south coast.
Yeah.
And that's where the bombers and tankers were. South of UDORN was Ubon, which was also an F-4 base. And south of that was Karat, where the F-105s were. And there was an air base over on the Laotian border, kind of due east of UDORN, that was special ops. The guys who rescue crews were based there, along with guys flying strange airplanes.
Is that where Air America was?
Air America was at UDORN mostly. The biggest installation was there. And of course they had bases in Laos, which nobody knew about at the time, of course, except everybody knew. But we had probably as many airplanes in Thailand during the war as there are in the Air Force now.
Yeah, well, I'm going to interject here because we're going to have maps so we can show people where different people were.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I'm asking those questions. So
Okay.
Because I've been to Utapao and Karat, I know where those are, and I've been all over, southern Thailand. So I'm trying to picture in my mind where you were.
Well,
But then we'll literally have
UDORN,
maps.
the town of UDORN is on the second, third, fourth largest town in Thailand.
Okay.
And it's on the map.
I've had to have been there. So, but I was there for 6 weeks, and a lot of those places were just there for one day. So some of the stuff
Yeah.
melds together. But to give folks an idea of where you went. So, what was your first day in country like?
My first day in country was like a vacation because I got stuck in Bangkok waiting for transportation north, and it's probably no different now than it was then. It's a huge bustling urban city with skyscrapers and hotels and entertainment, and lots of touristy things, tourist stops.
So how long were you in Bangkok?
I was in Bangkok for just like 24 hours, and then I went out to the air base there, and it was the commercial airfield, but we Air Force used it to transport people around the country, and got on a C-130 and flew from there to UDORN. And when I got to UDORN, I was met at the passenger terminal by one of the guys from my squadron, who put me in the pickup truck and took me over to the Hooches, which is one-story wooden barracks that had 6 or 8 rooms, and they were clustered together. and each squadron on base had 2 or 3 of those. So I dropped off my bags, and they took me over to the squadron, and I got introduced to the squadron commander and ops officer. I met my flight commander and met the squadron mascot, whose name was Eldridge Cleaver. He was a Black Panther. I don't know if you can put that.
I don't know either. I'm sitting there, show a picture of Eldridge Cleaver, show a picture of the Black Panther.
Well, that's that squadron patch over there with the Black Panther.
We have the tiptoe around that one.
Well, we could just call him Eldridge.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah, why don't you say you met the squadron mascot Eldridge?
Just as an aside,
Yeah.
when the base was closed, Eldridge was kind of an old mascot by then, and he was taken through an incredible amount of paperwork. I'm told I was no longer in the squadron, and he went to the zoo in Phoenix, where he lived until he didn't.
So, what was your first assignment?
My first assignment was to go to New Guy School, where they teach you about the local area, the flying regulations, because each base has its own separate set of flying that goes into the Air Force reg about flying, what you may do and may not do, and also, excuse me, and also a kind of a tour around the facilities that you'd be using. They have there was an intelligence shop there, and because we were a base that had RF-4s as well as F-4s, and the RFs were reconnaissance aircraft who took a variety of almost always black and white pictures that then the intelligence shop would use to create target packages. When you were going somewhere, they almost always had a picture of it, so you would know where you're going. So the process, the technical process of walking in the door and then going to fly a mission, there's a lot of stuff in between that has to do with learning about the target area, you know, what if any safe approaches there are, what kind of ordnance you're going to be using, because you don't choose. The airplane is, that information has already been developed the night before, and the airplane has been loaded with weapons and fuel for that particular mission. And so you get the weather, you get the intelligence briefing, then you go get the crew briefing, because when you're flying separate airplanes, the big airplanes that fly solo with multiple crew members in them also do crew briefings, and both of those are necessary. But with an airplane like the F-4 with 2 people on it, and typically in the daytime we would fly 4 airplanes, and so getting 4 airplanes organized and off the ground on time and to the tanker if you're doing air refueling, which we almost always did, and then how to perform in the target area takes forethought, and particularly for a new guy, that's a lot of things to absorb. And so there's a ground school in advance of that teaches you how that works before you ever go on the first mission. So then the next day or so, went on the first mission with flight instructor, and we went through the routine that had been explained to me, and I basically understood it, because by the time I got there I had 200 hours in the airplane, and which is a lot for a student, but I got drafted to go fly extra missions when I was in training, because we had more front seaters than back seaters. So in addition to training with my own front seater, I got to go ride with instructor pilots and other front seaters. So I had probably 10%, 15% more flights than anybody else. But basically, had I not had those extra flights, I still had the training to go do what we were doing, because we flew single ships and 2 ships and 4 ships in training, and we did the same thing in combat. Very rarely single ships, because it seems like a lot of times when that happens, the single ship disappears. And we had 2 of those in my squadron while I was there, guys who were on single ship missions and just disappeared, and I don't know they've ever been found. So generally you flew 2 airplanes, and it's called, the term of the Air Force is called mutual support. So if you're flying, you're not just looking at your own mission, you're watching the other airplane. Because if you take ground fire, you may not see it coming. The most dangerous stuff is that which comes straight up underneath you and you don't see it till it hits. So we watch out for each other, and that's done with every formation and in every mission. Bombing missions are air-to-air missions. So then I had my first mission with an instructor, and then thereafter I was crewed with a guy, and I just happened to be crewed with this crusty old major who was really a fine guy, and I've lost contact with him. I can't find him anymore. But he was excellent pilot and calm as could be, and kind of fun-seeking. It's kind of hard to appreciate, but at the time we had a couple of really tough days with long missions, and so we would, after air refueling, either from the target to the air refueling, like he would take a nap and I would fly, or after air refueling, I would take a nap and he would fly. That's the only time I've ever slept on an airplane, was just when I was dog tired after 12 hours of sweating in an airplane.
So what was your rank at this time? I meant
I
to
was
ask that earlier.
I was went to NAV training as a new second lieutenant. I was a second lieutenant all the way through training. Pardon me, the month that I graduated from F4 training, I made first lieutenant, and so I was a first lieutenant all the way through my first tour.
Okay. What kind of armaments did your F4s have?
Well, a variety. For air-to-ground missions, we flew a lot with what are called slicks, the 500-pound general-purpose bomb, which could be also configured, which we did for close air support. They'd take that same bomb and put a fin on it that would deploy in flight, and those were called high drags. And these extra large fins would fold out from the body of the bomb and slow it down, so that you got a lot closer to your target, and therefore you were likely to be more accurate. We also flew, particularly the missions to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we flew with what's called CBUs, cluster bomb units. And there was a wide variety of those, but we normally used ones that came in what was called a clamshell housing that was like a general purpose bomb, but it had a seam down the middle and it would open in the air. And by the time I was doing that, they had a radar sensor on the nose of it, so you could select what altitude you wanted it to open, and then it would disperse these smaller bomblets that were, there's some nomenclature that goes with the big ones and the little ones, but the big ones are kind of basically pineapple sized. And then we rarely use napalm. It's what we were going against was trucks and ammunition storage sites mostly, and that's good at burning down trees, but not much else. And because the canisters tumble, they're not very accurate. You have to really be close to your work to hit what you're aiming at. And then my first tour, we flew very, very few air-to-air missions, and all of those were what's called BARCAP, and it's Barrier Combat Air Patrol, and just put your airplane between the North Vietnamese airplanes and whatever's going on the friendly side. And we didn't do much of that my first tour, because by then there was a bombing halt and nobody was going over North Vietnam much, but we did occasionally. Something about those accords, we didn't go do bombing in North Vietnam, but we did do reconnaissance. And so the RF-4s, which normally flew alone, always had an escort when they went over North Vietnam. So when we were flying recce escort, we called it, we carried air-to-air loads a lot.
And so rockets?
Very seldom rockets. Rockets are something left over from World War II that I don't know who had the contract for, but they were not very accurate, and they had a habit of colliding and breaking pieces off that your engine might ingest, and nobody liked using those.
And what about machine guns?
the aircraft I was flying at the time was an F-4D, and it did not have an internal cannon. My second tour, we had E models, and they did have cannons, but they could load a gun on the center line, and all of those guns have a gun nomenclature. This was I think it was a Gal 24, and it was basically a Gatling gun. It's 6 barrels, 20 millimeter, and it would carry about 2,000 rounds, and you could empty those in about 5 seconds if you held the trigger down. So the idea was to get a couple hundred rounds out on a pass and preserve your ammunition for another pass.
I've seen those on helicopters, but I haven't seen them on fixed
Smaller. The helicopters carry the smaller ones.
Okay.
Those are typically 7.62s.
So, on your first, let's go through your first tour, and then we'll go in between and review the second tour. When you got to Southeast Asia, what really grabbed you about being different from the States?
Well, for one thing, the weather was very different. You had 2 seasons, hot and wet and hot and dry. And none of those were comfortable weather conditions. But I think probably the thing that struck me most was how primitive the locals lived. I mean, they typically, and I've been to a couple homes, and in my second tour, my roommate married a gal from Thailand, and so I got acquainted with some of the Thais, and kind of the middle class probably had running water but didn't have a toilet, and the upper class had running water and maybe a flush toilet. They ate food that was entirely unfamiliar to me, and I never did like Thai food, and I have to apologize to the Thais for that, because a lot of people did. It just wasn't my thing. I can remember having, politically incorrect again, shark fin soup. I didn't know that they were killing off the shark population of that. Only had it once, but it wasn't for love of sharks. It was didn't like the hot seasoning. It was
the texture.
blazing hot.
That's got that weird texture too.
I could and did eat food off the street vendors in Udorn. And rice balls, with or without sugar on them, are fine snacks. I could not do the dried squid though. Just couldn't.
What about? Did you spend any time in the jungle?
Very little. I did do jungle survival school in the Philippines, and that was a week's course, and it was kind of the same deal. It was several days of ground training, and then you go out in the jungle for 3 or 4 days, and we had Negrito guides, and the Negritos was a particular tribe in central Luzon that were our allies in World War II, and terrific people, all of them very small, not pygmies, just small, and very amiable, very personable people, and I enjoyed our guide a lot. But the last 2 days of it, they turn you loose and you have to go hide and try not to get caught. And everybody gets caught. But I went off by myself thinking that I'd have a better chance if I didn't have somebody to talk to. I'd be quieter. And in the course of the next 2 days' travel through the jungle, I can remember this one place. This was rainforest and moss on everything. And I walked past these 2 trees covered in moss, and they had a stack of mortar shells in between them, also covered in moss. This is stuff left over from World War II. They're just bizarre. But yeah, the next morning I got up at daylight, and there were 2 little kids standing there, and they gave you what was called rice chits. You get basically kind of like the hanging tag the car dealer might give you when they take your car in for service. And you get 3 of them. And the first little kid, you go, "Kid, I'll give you 2 of these if you don't rat me out." And he goes, "Sure, GI." And they give him the 2 chits, and he calls his little brother over and gets the 3rd one. And then the helicopter comes and gets you.
So, during the rainy season, could you guys fly?
Oh yes, wasn't fun. You would invariably get soaking wet before you got in the airplane, and you'd be 30 minutes or an hour with the air conditioner or the heater, depending on what was happening, drying you out. It was very uncomfortable, hot and muggy, and the inside of the cockpit would fog up, and you'd have to run the defroster on full hot, even though you're already hot, to be able to see out. Very often the visibility is low. Only a couple times did we have to go land someplace else. If we got off the ground, generally we could get back on the ground. But sometimes, you know, if the big part of the thunderstorm's over the airfield, you'd go land it. You know, typically we'd go land at Ubon. Typically people at Ubon would come and land at Udorn. But that was fairly unusual.
So how did the heat affect your flying?
Just made you really uncomfortable. We always carried basically everybody had a plastic whiskey flask that you filled up with water and froze and put it in your G-suit pocket so you'd have something to drink along the way. And always, by the time you got to drinking, you know, when you had any time to do that, you'd take a drink of that. It had already melted. And by the time you came back, if you drank some more before you landed, it was already hot. But you always carried a couple of pints of water with you because you just get dehydrated.
How long would a typical mission last?
Most of the time, an individual mission would last an hour and a half or 2 hours. But there were others that were longer. My squadron in particular had a mission that was called can't think of the aircraft call sign, but it was basically escorting a C-130 gunship. Spectre escort, that was their call sign, was Spectre. And this was a C-130 with some fairly advanced avionics on it, as well as a 30 millimeter cannon. And later in the war, they mounted howitzers in them. And the C-130 would fly in a circle and using infrared, which we weren't equipped with, find and shoot targets. And if it happened to be a truck convoy, which very often it was, the C-130 might shoot the first truck and the last truck, and you'd have a string down a valley of trucks that couldn't get around either direction. And then we carried ammunition to drop on the trucks and clean out the convoys. We also had some other ammunition that was designed for use on gunnery, because the nature of this AC-130 was it had to fly in a circle. It always had its left wing pointed at the ground, and the gunners on the ground soon figured that out and would be able to figure how far in front of the stream of bullets coming out of the AC-130 to shoot at the C-130. So if anybody fired, the C-130 would cease fire, roll the other way, and one of us would always be in position to drop bombs on a gun that was, say, within the orbit of the C-130. And those missions were very often all night long. We'd take off at midnight and not get back till daylight the next day. And just go back to air refueling tanker and refuel and go again. So it was a string of hour and a half missions put together.
So were most of your missions in the daytime or at night?
Most guys' missions were in the daytime. I was in a crew that got along really well together and flew well together. And so we were assigned a 3 month stint of night flying. And we flew mostly Spectre escorts. But we also flew other night missions, other places, mostly in Laos, and mostly on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But we got along so well together. And truth to tell, being night flyers got us out of the daytime crap that everybody else had to go through. You know, the wing safety meeting and the lecture about stuff from the flight surgeon, and you know, all kinds of things that annoyed everybody. But we didn't have to go because we were flying nights. But mostly we were really good at it. And so we volunteered to stay for another 3 months. So I flew nights for 6 months straight. And it was it was more comfortable most of the time in the daytime because it was always blazing hot in the daytime, whether it was raining or not. And at night, it cooled off considerably.
So, your first tour, how many months?
12. Got there the end of November and left the end of November. In fact, I flew a mission the day I flew out of Udorn to
Really?
Bangkok. And I flew an early morning mission.
So, where did you go for R&R?
I went to Australia, being a young single bachelor, making in excess of $300 a month. I just had money to burn. So I took a charter flight. Actually, the Air Force flew me to Saigon. From there, I took a charter flight along with a half a plane load of Army guys to Sydney, Australia. And we stopped in Darwin, which is about halfway to Sydney from Bangkok, or from Saigon. And spent a week there and had a marvelous time.
So, you spent most of your time in your first tour over Vietnam and in Thailand.
Right, that's correct.
So, when you come back after your first tour, where do you go?
Well, in its infinite wisdom, I volunteered to go to Europe, which is Air Force calls it a consecutive overseas assignment. So in their infinite wisdom, they sent me to Japan instead. And the squadron I was assigned to in Japan spent half its time in Korea. So I went back and forth from Japan to Korea and flew some in Japan and some in Korea. And then they closed the base. So my year-and-a-half tour turned out to only be one. And I went from there. I was assigned to North Carolina. Along the way, turns out the Department of Defense had schools. And the school in Misawa had some very attractive school teachers, and I married one.
So, where was the base in Japan?
This was in the northern part of Japan. Air Force had one base near Tokyo, and this one was at Misawa, which is the north end of the Honshu Island, and it was at a big freshwater bay, which is where the Japanese practiced to bomb Pearl Harbor at in World War II.
Really? Because I've been from Tokyo down to the end of Honshu. I've not been north of Sendai. So.
Yeah, for some reason the Marines got the south end. Go figure.
So, so you go to North Carolina after Japan and Korea, and then when is your next tour of duty in Vietnam?
While I was in North Carolina, actually, my wife and I had gone on a trip to Florida, and while I was gone, there was a thing on the radio about that the U.S. was sending squadrons to Thailand, and the story we had back home was, when anybody goes, we're going to be first. And so we curtailed the vacation. I went back. By the time I got there, the squadron was empty. There was 2 forlorn-looking guys there who had not got checked out yet and didn't get to go, and everybody else had gone to Thailand. So I was stuck there with those guys for a few days, and I couldn't stand it. So I went and talked to the deputy commander of our wing and said, send me over. I should be with my guys. And he said, they already took people from other bases in your place. Okay, well, just be advised, when they need another person, I'm ready. And he called me back the next day and he said, the squadron at Eglin is being deployed. You want to go with them? And I said, sure. Because I was the worst kind of stepchild at that base. You're 3 or 4 guys with no airplanes and nothing worthwhile to do, and they would think up duties for you that were nobody else wanted, and you didn't get a choice. So anyway, I bailed out on bad stuff and my wife, and went and flew with the guys from Eglin. And we, as chance happened, got deployed to Udorn. So I went back again. But the difference was the focus, starting in spring of 1972, was going back to North Vietnam. And luck of the draw, most of my flights then were air to air, escorting the bombers and other support aircraft and defending them from MiGs.
Was this Operation Linebacker?
Linebacker 2. And this was pretty much all year of 72. I got out of sync with my squadron. Those guys went to UBOD and they flew the dog awful missions. They were the guys responsible for dropping chaff for the bombing runs over North Vietnam. And the problem with that is you have to fly straight and level. You can't do that mission and evade surface-to-air missiles or anything else. So they had a fairly high attrition rate. Lost several of my guys from North Carolina. And anyway, but because they'd sent so many squadrons over initially in April that they were going to have a rotation schedule. So my squadron from North Carolina only stayed 3 months. Then they went back to North Carolina, and I stayed 7 months. Then I went back to North Carolina, by which time they were back in Vietnam. And so one of the things about Air Force is it's probably a closer knit organization than a company in the Army. It would be more like a platoon, I think, because we all knew each other. We all flew together. Mostly, a squadron is divided into 4 flights. You usually flew with guys in your flights. But something would happen and somebody else would need a backseater, or you would miss a training square or something that you needed to do, and you'd go to fly with somebody else to do it. But you knew everybody in the squadron. And after you deployed with people for 6 months, you knew them really well. And it's like, you know, the Army guys talk about, you know, no strangers in foxholes and whatnot. You just knew guys in the squadron. We'll have to stop because that'll keep ringing. And might as well answer. Hello? Hello? It's Joanne, I'm sure. Hello? Yes? Not quite, but soon. Okay, just come in quietly the back way. Okay, all right, bye. For some reason, her cell phone never notices that I picked up the phone.
Okay, you're talking about the esprit de corps.
Make sure I'm back in the right place.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of messed up to not be with my squadron. Of course, I got to know the guys from Eglin real well, and the guy I flew with there was a close friend for years and years, and he retired out of Eglin and still lives there. And just terrific people.
So remind us which squadron you were in.
Okay, I was in the 334th at Seymour Johnson, North Carolina. I was attached to the 58th Squadron at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, and flew with them for the whole second tour. But it's still kind of messed up that I didn't get to go with my guys.
A comparison, because you're only the second person I can do this with. Talk about the difference between being in the Vietnam War under the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration.
World of difference. One of the things that happened, I talked earlier about reconnaissance escorts over North Vietnam, which were allowed under whatever that agreement was. The rules of engagement would change every day. If Henry Kissinger thought that, or whoever was negotiating with the Vietnamese at the time, thought that they were being recalcitrant, they would loosen up the ROE and they would say, you know, drop a bomb on that gun position if you think they might shoot at you. And then if things were going well at the talks in Paris, they would say, no, you can't even drop a bomb to defend the guy you're escorting. You can't shoot anybody for anything. And those are two extreme versions, but other things would happen. I remember there was a spot in Laos that was called the Chinese Cultural Mission. Best I could tell, it was really just a pagoda. but you couldn't drop a bomb within a, I don't know, 10-kilometer radius or something. And the North Vietnamese figured that out pretty quick, and they parked trucks there all the time. And you could see the truck trails going in, but the ROE said you couldn't do it. And I know there was one guy who did, and he got court-martialed. But he got the largest secondary explosion anybody ever seen in that part of the country because it cooked off a whole bunch of ammunition. That was what was going on with the Johnson administration. They had. Let me step back a ways.
Okay.
Put this in perspective. Everybody knows the Vietnam War was a lost cause, that we really didn't have any business being there in hindsight. But at the time, we were going through a couple of decades of conflict with the communists, which we appeared to be losing. The Russians have been exporting their version of communism to Eastern Europe since the end of World War II. After the Chinese took over, the Red Chinese took over from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, they started exporting their version of communism. When Castro took over Cuba, he started exporting his version of communism. It looked like it was spreading all over the place. And so the decision was taken to put your foot down somewhere. So the idea was put your foot down in Vietnam. Now, the French had just gotten kicked out when we got started up. And in my opinion, the problem was you shouldn't start a shooting war unless you decide to go to war. At that point, diplomacy has to stop. You do diplomacy until you can't do diplomacy, and when you decide to go to war, you go to war and you win the war. You don't screw around with it. I diverge a little bit, but the thing is that we were in a war, and the war was being run from the White House by LBJ, who had absolutely no military experience and apparently didn't listen to his military advisors, or they were yes men. I don't know. But I always thought, and I thought at the time, that if the general in charge of the Vietnam War didn't give good warfighting advice, or he gave it and the president didn't take it, he ought to resign and let somebody else run this thing. But we had no business being halfway into a war. That just gets people killed and you get no results. So the thing was that Vietnam was started because we needed to stop communism, we thought, and that would work. And the phrase at the time was the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, then Cambodia would fall, Laos would fall, Thailand would fall, and so on, and it would just keep going. Well, it turned out to be half right. When we bailed out of Vietnam, in fact, Vietnam became and is now communist. Cambodia fell to the communists and had a horrible, horrible several decades. Laos fell to the communists. I think the only thing that's changing all of that is those people have gotten to be more capitalistic than communism. But the point is, they were right. Those things did fall. But we were being run by LBJ, who gave us as a Secretary of Defense a really bright executive from Ford Motor Company, who also knew nothing at all about the war or how to fight it. So we were fighting a war that we probably shouldn't have been in. We were doing a halfway effort. We were losing people and spending a lot of money and gaining nothing. Well, when Tricky Dick came in, all of that shifted. The idea was make some serious inroads, negotiate a peace that would work. Turned out it didn't. But the war fighting was gone back to taking the offensive instead of being the defensive. And that's been a principle of arms since ancient Chinese, Napoleon Code. All of those guys knew that if you were just defending something, you don't win. And that's all we were doing. We were defending the South, except for that brief year or so when we attacked North Vietnam all out. And I'm sure that war would not have ended with anything other than even more shamefully than it was if we hadn't taken the approach that we took starting in 1972.
Yeah, and that's, and one of the things that I've asked everybody, why were we there? And you've done the best of articulating that of anybody, so I didn't have to ask you that question. But I think it's interesting that I don't care who you talk to, who you read, even to the American public, the rationale for being there was never explained, never articulated.
No. And there's a lot of talk recently about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Tonkin resolution. That may have been an excuse that was useful in Washington, but I think it had nothing to do with anything. I mean, we were going to go, and maybe that made a headline. And there's some discussion about whether it's true or not, and I, to this day, don't know whether that incident actually occurred. I wouldn't be surprised either way.
It's not been declassified. The documents aren't declassified yet. So
There was a time when I probably had high enough security clearance to know that, but I suppose that
Yeah.
was fairly closely held.
that's 65. It'll be
40.
75 years is what, because under the George Bush administration, they upped it from 50 years to 75.
Hmm.
So we got a few more years to wait to find it out. Couple more questions. We're winding down, but a couple more questions. How do you see now and at the time the difference between your first and second missions beyond what you already told me?
Well, for me personally, it was a different war. We were going over North Vietnam in a little tidbit. During May of 1972, the North Vietnamese shot more surface-to-air missiles, SA-2s, during that month than they had during the entire war up to that point. So it was not only intense on our side, but it was intense on their side. But the great difference between that and from what had happened in 1967 when we were still going north is we had developed some precision guided munitions. 2,000-pound laser guided bomb made all the difference in the air to ground war, because in 66 or 67, whenever the F-105s took out the Paul Domer Bridge in downtown Hanoi, it took 100 planes a day for several days to take out 2 spans of that bridge. When we went back in 72, and I was there doing air cover for the bombers, they took the whole bridge out. The first 3 airplanes took that bridge out with laser guided bombs, and then they went up the Northwest Railroad and took out 3 more bridges with the bombs they didn't have to use the first time on the Paul Domer Bridge. Those things made a world of difference. We hit what we were aiming at. And I think it doesn't take a genius to learn that if you have supplies coming out of a central location like Haiphong Harbor that gets loaded on trucks and taken down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and then gets dispersed to backpacks and bicycles that you're then dropping unguided bombs on, that is not a winning concept. If you take out the supplies at their source when they're concentrated with concentrated effort instead of dispersed effort, you just can't. You cannot win that if you don't go to the source, and that's what we were doing in '72. And although nobody bombed Haiphong until like December, because we were afraid we'd annoy some people who were shipping war supplies into North Vietnam if we sunk one of their ships. In my mind, if you're supporting an enemy, you're an enemy. And we should have been bombing those ships, or told their owners not to bring them, tell Lloyd's of London not to bring them. Then maybe we could have not had to bomb Haiphong Harbor to start with.
The Christmas bombing.
We I guess the short answer is we had our effort dispersed over a wide terrain, 2 countries, occasionally 3 if when Cambodia got into it, as opposed to cutting off the supplies at their source. The Vietnamese had one reasonable harbor at Haiphong. They had others, but nothing as large and efficient as Haiphong. They had 2 railroads. If you shut down the 2 railroads in the one harbor, they can't prosecute a war because they can't get enough supplies down there to do it. That's how interdiction works. You choke the supplies, and then the guys on the ground at the other end have got an easier fight of it because their people they're shooting at don't have enough bullets to shoot back.
So, in your second tour, where did you go to do R&R?
I didn't. No, we just stayed. I did get a week to come home. We got there was a supply line going in and out of Udorn from the States, and very typically they would fly in and out of Eglin because at that time there was a special thing going on with air-to-air missiles. Let me digress a little bit.
Okay.
Early in the war, my first tour, for example, if you had the opportunity to shoot a missile, it probably wasn't going to work because it was old and dilapidated and had been sitting there in the sun and rain rotting for years. And so our air-to-air work was really hit or miss. We had a guy come from the test squadron to Udorn in 1972 because we were having such a low shoot ratio. I mean, Udorn in 1972 was where all the Air Force aces were. Steve Ritchie was there, Jeff Feinstein was there, Chuck de Bellevue was there. The guy nobody knows about, Bob Lodge, who was killed in action, was there. These were really good air-to-air people. They were missing, and the reason they were missing is because missiles were old and dilapidated. Well, this guy from Eglin knew they were developing a new one and had them sent over. Instead of testing them on the test range in Florida, they were tested in Udorn, and they hit what they were aimed at. So we had new stuff to use, and the new stuff worked.
So
Now back to your question.
let me ask you another one instead, because you've got what we need there. So when you finish your second tour of Vietnam, then where do you go?
Well, I came back to North Carolina, finished up there. I was transferred to Wing Headquarters to be a flight examiner. So my last year in North Carolina, I tested, gave aircrews written tests, and then also flew on their check rides when they were having their annual flight examination. And when at the end of that year, we went to England.
And you were in England for 3 years.
And then back to the States. I was at Nellis for 3 years, and then back overseas to Germany for 4 years. Should have been a 3-year assignment, but I spent a year flying airplanes at Hahn, and then got transferred to Air Force Headquarters at Ramstein. And so I spent a year at Hahn, 3 years at Ramstein. Then I came back to the States to 12th Air Force in Texas for 3 years, and that wrapped up 20.
And you left the service with what rank?
I was major.
I thought you were colonel.
That could have happened, but the fact of the matter is I was a flyer, and my last assignment in Europe at Ramstein was to send all the F-4s home to the Guard and Reserve. And I saw in the news last week the last 5 flying F-4s in the U.S. inventory are being mothballed. So they're done. They were done operationally by the time I finished up in Germany.
So how much aircraft did we leave behind? Because we left tons of tanks, and the Army basically left everything behind
In
Vietnam.
no, we flew our airplanes out. The ones we left behind were in pieces.
Is there anything else you want to tell us?
I think I probably told you more than you asked for to start.
No, this is great.
No, I really thoroughly enjoyed flying fighters. It was, as they said when I went first to F4 school, the guy said, it's the most fun you can have with your clothes on.
There is one more question.
Okay.
Because this is one we're asking everybody. And I think it was, I know it was different for Jim Staffney because he was career military, and I would think it'd be different for you. But the folks who were short timers, they said that they were not welcomed home as veterans.
Yep.
Did you experience that at all?
I did, but it wasn't. When I came back, I flew into Travis Air Force Base in Northern California, and to get home, I went to San Francisco and flew out commercially. And on the way, I had to go through downtown San Francisco. I don't remember exactly why, but there was a bus involved, and it had to change in the downtown bus station. And San Francisco was really, really full of hippies, and those were the people who adamantly opposed the war. And I got looked at strangely. I get snubbed, but I didn't get spit on like some of the guys did. And I know that happened. The guys that happened to, it's secondhand, but it's not third or fourth hand. And yelled at. And you know, I know one of the guys in my squadron had a couple of people in his face calling him a baby killer, and I'm sure we kill babies, but we didn't on purpose. And there are people who do, like the Viet Cong did. You can see plenty of pictures of that if you want to look for it, but all anybody sees is the kids that we harmed, and nobody was proud of that. But no, I was not welcomed back by anybody outside the Air Force, but I wasn't abused, so I'm neutral about that.
Daniel, you got anything else?
No, I mean, one thing, if you can think on top of your head, like nobody goes to war and has anything fun to tell about it. But as far as a pilot, for for somebody that sat there on that airplane and you went and you have so many different missions, what was that one mission that you went and when you came back home you were like, dang, that was a good job that we did, that you are proud of being what you are?
There was one of those.
Hold on real quick.
The most memorable mission that I had was flying reconnaissance recce escort again, and we had what was called Run for the Roses, and that was the daylight run into North Vietnam to scout the targets for the next day. And so the reconnaissance airplane would fly in. We would fly over a couple other places that might be targets so nobody could tell for sure, and then fly over the target. And this particular mission, we were flying real low altitude, and we went just north of the Yen Bai airfield. And as we approached it, there was what we call a beeper. It's an emergency locator beacon that air crews actuate when they're on the ground. And you don't hear those in North Vietnam. But we marked the location anyway. The next day, the guys who were flying in that part of the world got a radio contact from a GI flyer who had been down on the ground for almost 2 weeks. His name's Roger Locker, and he's on the internet. You can look at his story. He is the guy who spent the longest time on the ground and was recovered in North Vietnam during the entire war. And I had a hand in that, had a small hand in that. But I was also on the ground at Udorn when the helicopter brought Roger back to the base, and you never seen a more bedraggled but happier guy. And I think there are pictures of that online somewhere too.
When you're talking about altitude, what was your normal flying altitude?
Because we were heavy, you couldn't fly higher than 29,000 feet would be pretty high. When you got down to ordnance delivery, your altitude above ground might be 12,000 feet, and then a bombing run with a release down at 4,500 feet. If you were in close air support like we were on the missions in South Vietnam, with that kind of ordnance, your release altitude might be 2,000 feet, which is inside the fragmentary envelope for the bomb you're dropping, but that's the best accuracy you could get to support the troops on the ground. And if you're shooting the cannon, that delivery is bottoms out at maybe 1,200-1,500 feet. And that's in range for their 50 cals.
Yeah, one of the things that you never see pictures of are fixed wing and helicopters in proximity, and they had to be if you're flying that low.
They are, but you didn't work with helicopters because their speed, top end maybe 160, and you couldn't go that slow, except if you had your gear and flaps down, you're landing. You couldn't support that in level flight, and you certainly couldn't use any weapons at that speed.
I knew there was a reason, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. The rescue helicopters that the Air Force had, we call them Jolly Greens or HH-53s. Those were typically pilot, co-pilot, a crew chief, and a couple of door gunners who may or may not be PJs, rescue guys. Those are the heroes of that war. Those guys, if they went out on a mission, and whether they recovered somebody or not, they always got shot up. Probably the most decorated guys in the Air Force and deserved to be. But the guys that escorted them were A-1Es ordinarily, which is a kind of a Korean War era prop airplane that was low and slow and could fly with helicopters. So when you had somebody close supporting helicopters, it's a prop airplane.
Yeah, we're interviewing a helicopter pilot tomorrow in front of his bird.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
My cousin Roy was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and also from Kobo, and he retired a colonel, but he got 2 helicopters shot out from underneath him in Vietnam.
There's a guy here in town, he's retired here, his name's Gino something. He was a Marine pilot. He flew both planes and helicopters, and he got shot down. He never got shot down in a plane, but he got shot down in a helicopter at least once.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you have a place for this information or not, but because Udorn was the largest base for Air America, we were acquainted with several of those guys. And they're not as crazy as the ones in the movie, but they're not far off. I had a guy that I ran into several times, it's bizarre, a Marine helicopter pilot, and he was doing something probably spooky in Laos, and he landed at Udorn, and I met him at the officers club and had a couple drinks and went and ate dinner, and I ran into him back again there, and this time he wasn't in a flight suit, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, well, he thought if he was going to have to fly helicopters and get shot at, he'd at least get well paid for it, so he joined up Air America when he got out of the Marine Corps. And he was at Udorn for, I don't know, about a month. And I saw him, and he was dressed up in traveling clothes, and I asked him where he was going this time. He said, I'm getting out of here. He said, they don't pay you enough to do that kind of stuff.
Wow.
But they were flying helicopters in at low altitude at night, which helicopters then and most now are still not equipped for, except the special air guys at Fort Campbell. And dropping supplies to the Laotian, well, they're called the Royalists. These are guys who were anti-communist fighters, and he was getting shot at a lot, and if his airplane went down and the bad guys got him, that didn't end well. They didn't just shoot you; they basically tortured people to death because bodies had been found. And he said, you know, he was a lieutenant like me, and so we were making somewhere between $300 and $400 a month, which whatever that works out to be. He was making 10 times that flying for Air America, and it wasn't enough. So they're helicopter guys. Some crazy.
Yeah, I think most helicopter guys are crazy. The ones I've met anyway.
I've been on helicopter twice, once out of necessity and once just for fun. And the blades going through the sunlight just drives me nuts. It's like being in a flickering strobe light and trying to work.
I don't dig helicopter either.
I think that's a wrap.
That's a wrap. I think that as a helicopter guys are crazy. That could be a good introduction for the whenever
We're due tomorrow.
yeah, for him to start his.
Like I said, I'm awfully glad somebody does that mission, and I'm awfully glad it's not me.
Yeah, and one thing that's going to happen with if I understand correctly, with the complete interviews, those are going to be archived at Tech, so that folks can see the entire interviews if they want to.
Cool.
But you'll probably have about a minute.
I should give you some background music.
What?
One of the things that was common for all the forces, everybody had troubadours, guys who sang and wrote songs about their experience. In my squadron, it was Chip Dockery, and that was in the 13th Squadron in Thailand. And I can remember, sitting with Chip and being quiet while he played, because he played the guitar, and he would play it and record it on one track on his tape recorder, and then play the melody first, and then record next to it the harmony, guitar and voice, and so it was kind of cool. But then at UBON, the guy down there was Dick Jonas, and Dick Jonas we overlapped my first tour a little bit. I didn't know him at the time, but we were both assigned to Japan. And he's a marvelous guy, and he wrote some fantastic songs, most of which can't be repeated in polite company. But after the war, all of the songs, he wrote songs, he did not write the music. So he abducted lots of country and bluegrass and pop tunes to play his songs to. And when he got out, everybody wanted those, but you couldn't do it because it was copyrighted. Yeah. Well, since then, the copyrights on all the songs have expired, so he now has published the original version, mostly unedited. But when he was at UBON, he was, I think it was the 34th Squadron, 37th, I forget. But it was the emblem is a cartoon Satan, and so the squadron called Sons of Satan's Angels, and he wrote that song. Also, there's an expression, particularly if you're dodging missiles. You ready to tune this one out? It's called "Fuck Shit Hate," and it's sort of compressed all the foul language that you knew into a quick phrase, and so that's you'll see some edited versions of that on squadron patches that the tab underneath just says FSH. So Dick Jonas has 2 albums. It's FSH Volume 1 and Volume 2. And then there's another guy. We're having a senior moment here. He lives in Brentwood. He's not originally from here, but he wrote several notable songs from Vietnam. But he also wrote some others from Europe, and because I was stationed with him in Germany at Hahn, and when the squadron and those squadrons deployed to Turkey a lot. We went to Spain for a month every winter, and to Turkey a month or 2 during the rest of the year, sometime. And guys would bring back souvenirs from there. And so he's got this whole song about the souvenirs that people buy. And, you know, you got pearls from Japan and rock lanterns from Iran, because in those days you could go to Iran, which are very humorous. And then his southern one is the title. It has nothing to do with the Air Force, called Butter Beans. But
That's nice.
Oh,
It'd be great if we could reach out and get one of those.
Yeah, I'll
songs
leave-
to
I've written it
play.
down.
I can tell you what that guy's name is that I can't think of, because his post Air Force career was recording and selling music of the military bands,
Oh,
because
really?
they are prohibited from selling their own music.
Really?
So he made a deal with them to record their concerts
Yeah.
and sell the CDs, and